Oh, you're here. Why didn't you tell me you're here? Well, I'm glad you're here because today I want to do another one of my series that I'm calling my Reconsidered series, where I'm looking at a whole bunch of phenomena that I think we tend to treat pretty negatively. For instance, my last two videos were on madness and stupidity. Well, this video is going to be about dilettantism, which is why I'm playing this electric guitar, because I'm kind of a dilettante with respect to rock music and playing rock music. So without further ado, here it is. Dilettantism Reconsidered. Okay, like I said in the introduction, I want to make a video on dilettantism. But maybe I should begin by defining what I mean by dilettantism, especially since the word doesn't necessarily figure prominently in everyone's everyday vocabulary. Webster's defines dilettantism as a lack of the level of skill associated with an expert or professional, and gives its principal synonym as amateurism. A dilettante, in turn, is defined by Webster's as either an admirer or lover of the arts, or a person having a superficial interest in an art or a branch of knowledge. In other words, a dabbler. At the level of connotation, however, I find that both terms usually have a somewhat pejorative cast. True, there are definitely darker epithets to be found in the vast and varied lexicon of insults, but I'd say that being called a dilettante is usually somewhat insulting. But why so? Well, the first obvious answer is that dilettantes don't usually possess the expertise of professionals. According to our culture's prevailing values, to be an amateur at something is usually, well, to be unprofessional at it. That's because professionals are supposed to be good enough at what they do to be paid for it, whereas amateurs are not. So, we tend to disparage amateurs and dilettantes because our cultural values tend to operate according to the logic that underlies the exchange of services and products for capital. Basically, the values of the marketplace. And dilettantism doesn't easily align with those values because it isn't very saleable. But of course, here, the obvious question is, why should the values of the marketplace supersede any other type in our everyday estimation of things? After all, if all we ever do is worship mammon and its attendant value systems, life ends up being pretty perverse. For instance, let's look at love, which I think is a pretty important part of life for most people. Well, when it comes to love, the prevailing logic of the marketplace would tell us that we should naturally value the saleable expertise of the professional over the relatively modest proficiency of the amateur. But the fairly obvious problem with this is that when we introduce money and professionalism into love's equation, it ends up compromising and vitiating a lot of what we were looking for in the first place. Well, at least what most of us were looking for. That's because, as its Latinate etymology would suggest, an amateur is a kind of lover and acts primarily out of love, an intrinsic motivation, whereas a professional acts primarily in order to get paid, an extrinsic motivation. Of course, sometimes professionals do fall in love with what they do, which is great, but the point is that being paid is what defines a professional, as opposed to an amateur, who does things out of simple, straightforward desire. And of course, at this point, it's probably also good to acknowledge that there's nothing inherently wrong with being good enough at something to get paid for it. After all, competing successfully in the marketplace can be a wonderful experience, and it adds many, many important innovations and benefits to our world. Personally, I'm grateful to be living in a capitalist society. Well, at least a nominally capitalist society, despite its occasional shortcomings and contradictions. So the problem, as I see it, is not with competition or with the marketplace or with capitalism per se. The problem arises when our lives become completely subsumed by the activity of pursuing extrinsic rewards, when we become imbalanced in that direction at the expense of experiencing what's intrinsically fulfilling. And it seems to me that our collective disparagement of dilettantism and amateurism is a marker of that kind of imbalance in our lives. And when this state of imbalance comes home to roost at the individual level, it can easily degenerate into a kind of monomaniacal fixation where we end up devoting an inordinate fraction of our time and energy to pursuing extrinsic ends, most obviously in the form of the money and status that come from our jobs, while neglecting the dimension of intrinsic satisfaction in our lives. In the mid-19th century, Henry David Thoreau once famously observed that the mass of men, and women too, lead lives of quiet desperation. And I think that this is probably even more true today than it was in Thoreau's time. It's because while we may be successful and well regarded, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're fulfilled as human beings. In fact, it happens often enough that the most successful people are completely impoverished at the level of what really matters in life. And all things considered, it seems to me that for most people, a strategic dilettantism is much more conducive to fulfillment than monomaniacal professionalism is. Okay, let me illustrate this with a personal story that you may be able to apply to your own situation in life. After a brief career writing software professionally and then a much longer career as a college professor, I had the realization that except for sleeping, there's actually nothing in this world I want to do for 40 hours per week every week. And as I was realizing this, I reflected upon all of the things that I really enjoy doing in this world. For instance, I really enjoy playing rock music, but I don't want to do it 40 hours every week. I really enjoy physical training and exercise, but I don't want to do that for 40 hours every week either. I really enjoy teaching college classes for which I actually get paid, but the same is true of that too. You get the picture. And it seems to me that most of the people I encounter in this world are pretty much in the same boat. So I've come to perceive that the usual socially sanctioned recipe for our lives, which involves finding something we can enjoy doing, or at least tolerate doing, for 40 hours every week, all of that is really just a kind of unrealistic fiction for most people. Yeah, okay, occasionally there's a counterexample. Someone who really does find tremendous fulfillment in devoting himself to one thing that exclusively. Probably Mozart was that way, or maybe Magnus Carlsen. But the majority of us just don't seem to be built that way, and it seems to me that a lot of us are falling prey to a socially constructed illusion when we think that we should be built that way. My theory is that most of us, myself included, are really built more for what I like to call strategic dilettantism. This doesn't mean simply renouncing the values and benefits of the marketplace, because doing that wouldn't be very strategic for most of us. What strategic dilettantism means is first questioning the template for life that most of us have accepted without thinking too hard about it, mostly because we've been propagandized into it from a very early age, and then eventually learning to live beyond it. This deep questioning of our culture's prevailing status quo would also include learning to value and celebrate our amateurish impulses and desires, rather than simply dismissing them as mere dilettantism. But this, in turn, would mean learning to honor our imperfect, faltering, unprofessional attempts to explore life along its many avenues and dimensions. I think that when we were children, most of us had no problem with this. We simply enjoyed exploring whatever the day held, regardless of whether we were good at it or whether it produced any tangible benefits. But as we grew older, most of us learned to feel ashamed of the amateurish parts of ourselves, especially when we were repeatedly told that they aren't good enough. For some of us, it was math. For others, it was athletics. For me, it was singing. And over time, most of us learn to orient ourselves to life in terms of what other people tell us about ourselves, rather than in terms of what we actually enjoy. That is, we learned to sell our souls for the dubious benefits of external approval. And eventually, it seems like that's just how life is, that there's no real alternative to that paradigm. And then maybe, eventually, if we're lucky, we can have a midlife crisis and breakdown after a few decades when we discover, to our horror, that we've been living a lie all along. But if we're not so lucky, we'll probably simply continue to grind along, year after year, and eventually die with all of our inner desires unfulfilled. In my view, strategic dilettantism can serve as a kind of corrective to all of this. In addition to questioning a social status quo that doesn't actually fit a lot of us too well, strategic dilettantism means learning to let go of a lot of the stultifying self-seriousness of professionalism. It means learning to take life, including all of our faults, imperfections, and missteps, in a lighthearted, laughing way. It means learning, along with Voltaire, that the perfect and all of our overweening preoccupation with perfection is really the enemy of the good. It means learning to be something more than just a one-trick pony in life. And perhaps more than anything else, it means learning to cherish and revel in our dilettantism, and to savor it as a fine virtue to be cultivated and deepened as we mature. So, let me conclude this video with two short cautionary tales, one from the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche and the other from the Zen Buddhist Shunryu Suzuki. At one point, the protagonist in Nietzsche's Zarathustra encounters a man who claims to be the world's most renowned expert not only on leeches, but on the brains of leeches, and who has renounced all of the wide horizon of life to become that. And the question here for us is that paradigm really broad enough and deep enough to contain our souls? Are we really willing to sacrifice that much just to be regarded as some kind of expert on something that is cosmically inconsequential? Similarly, in Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, Shunryu Suzuki proclaims that in the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities, but in the expert's, there are few. This is not necessarily a way of disparaging the value of expertise, but of pointing out that expertise comes with a price, not least of which has to do with our relation to possibility. So, in the end, the question becomes, how do we really want to live? However, finding an answer to this question involves being able to know ourselves well enough to recognize a good answer when we see it. I know that, in my own case, I'd rather live toward a comparatively wide range of life's possibilities. At this point in my life, I have very little desire to be regarded as some kind of expert or professional, despite the fact that my job pretty much places me in that role. Anyhow, as the years pass, I find I'm becoming ever more acutely aware that the real expert on things is nothing other than the reality of life itself, and that my own pretensions to expertise are little more than overweening ego ambition. In other words, something to grow beyond. But hey, that's just my answer. Your results may vary. Not valid on all states of being, not necessarily void where prohibited. Have a great day.